The East has some pretty extreme history, but European history is interesting for sure.
There's something about white males where they're more inclined to take a risk. That's like you have Asians tend to have higher IQs than whites, but you have all these inventions. You have all these inventions coming from whites, despite not being the smartest ones. And I think it's a combination of like gumption and grit and risk taking, and it just leads to more inventions. Well,
I think it was. I know that you probably know.
Chinese
E. Michael Jones, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Well, E. Michael Jones has a hypothesis about this, which is kind of interesting. So, white cultures themselves are kind of young, right? They're actually kind of young. The European nations were basically all barbarians, and that's what the Romans called them, barbarians, because they went blah blah blah, right? That's why they called them barbarians. Yeah, that's why the Romans and the Greeks called them barbarians. Blah blah blah. That's what they thought they sounded like. Thought they sounded like idiots, and they lived in forests, the European forests, basically. Yeah. Once there was a move through to kind of culture the barbarians, they had all this natural resource around them. Massive forests. Some of these trees were, you never find anything like it. Again, all of Europe was a giant forest. So they had huge industry. They were able to kind of move into huge industry because they had a lot of resources. And so kind of the Jones hypothesis on this is Africans are way behind because they didn't have all of this access to resource for industry. There's just really nothing there in sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas in Europe, when the barbarian tribes which were there get domesticated, they had tons and tons of resources, and so they became very inventive.
But isn't the whole hypothesis about race and IQ that people in Africa had it easier? So they didn't have to survive, whereas whites had to survive the Siberian winters, and they got better at systems because they had to like pickle things and plan for the winter and insulate a home and have firewood for the winter months, but no one else really had to plan that far ahead.
So that's, if we're looking from kind of a purely evolutionary lens, which is what you're kind of looking at. Not really. That wouldn't really be the hypothesis because they also weren't getting run down by lions and tigers, and they also weren't, having nearly as much trouble.
Well, blacks can run fast.
So because of whites, right? But yes, Africa had all sorts of conditions that they were dealing with there that were every bit as bad as the conditions dealt with by these northern tribes, right? Same thing. They had all sorts of bad conditions, but they didn't have nearly as much in the way of naturalized resources which were useful. They had those things that nobody cared about then, right? If you're tribal, like gold and diamonds and rubies, right? Nobody gave a fuck about those things.
Those are rocks.
Yeah, those are dumb glittery rocks. We can't eat that. You know what I mean?
Well, why do you? Because I don't think it's arguable that whites are, especially males, are exceptionally good at systems. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because Christianity.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I agree with the Jones hypothesis that. So, well, the interesting thing about Christianity is you can take this kind of cross ethnos. You can say, yeah, the Scottish are a lot like the Irish. They're not Irish. And they're not English. And the English and the Scottish and the Irish have fought a lot of wars against each other.
Yeah.
They've done it tons and tons and tons.
600 years.
Yeah, but they have this great unification, right, that happened throughout all of Europe called Christianity. And there was a synergistic relationship between the church and the state. Well, the church itself, it had churches that it was the head of in all of these different countries, in England and in France. And it was all the Catholic Church, one church under one head. So it was really easy to communicate between these different nations for diplomacy, things like this. So systems gradually expanded from that.
The Viking Hersir. When Norwegian Vikings first raided the European coast in the 8th century AD, their leaders were not kings, princes, or jarls, but a middle rank of warrior known as the Hersir. At this time, the Hersir was typically an independent landowner or local chieftain. His equipment was usually superior to that of his followers. By the end of the 10th century, the independence of the Hersir was gone, and he was now typically a regional servant of the Norwegian king. The Hersir's equipment and status were now comparable to that of an immediate retainer of the Scandinavian or English king, similar, for example, to a huscarl at the time of the Battle of Hastings, 1066, a culture of violence. The fact that the earliest sources are written from the perspective of the Anglo-Saxon Church may well have distorted our knowledge of the earliest phases of Viking raiding in England. We know that King Offa was preparing the defenses of Kent against pagan seamen as early as 792, and it is probable that these were Scandinavian pirates. The terms pagans, pirates, and seamen had become synonymous with the Vikings by the end of the period. The apparent concentration of early raids on the monasteries of Lindisfarne, 793, and Iona, 795, probably conceals a picture of more widespread depredations. Continental raids show no such bias against the religious. The raiders off the Loire in 799, for example, are not noted as seeking out monastic communities. The Danish assault in 810 on the Carolingian province of Frisia and the subsequent attack in 820 may have been directed against important trading centers. Certainly by the mid-830s, settlements of economic importance had become the main targets of Viking attentions. The emphasis in Old English records on the ecclesiastical bias of Nordic raids is one aspect of the cultural divide between Scandinavians and Christian Europeans in the 8th century. Even in Denmark, the most advanced of the 3 Scandinavian nations, the relationship of basic units of society to the elite class was very different to that in northwestern Europe. The absence of a unified church or even a common religion weakened the possibility of a single national monarchy appearing. The lack of a central authority meant that the use of violence by the individual, tribe, or clan was institutionalized and accepted as inevitable. The increasingly powerful monarchies of the various English kingdoms were able to prevent violence by legislation that carried the sanction of the church. This intimate relationship of church and state limited aggression in a way Viking culture could not. Consequently, when circumstance allowed Scandinavian intrusions into broadly peaceful continental Europe, the unlimited use of violence, a feature of everyday life in the Nordic lands, found lucrative outlets. Training. In early Scandinavian society, the normal unit of warfare was the tribe. The subdivisions of this were the family or clan. The Old Norse word for these extended family groups was æt. In a culture where the family was the fundamental combat group, training would largely speaking be part of everyday life. Non-blood-related loyalties were mainly based around what is perhaps best termed the gift economy, which centered on the relationship between leader and followers. In this relationship could often become elevated to a level more normal to bonds of kinship. In effect, it resulted in the formation of artificial clans. Other versions of these simulated clans may have existed in groups of alienated, landless young men who gathered on the fringes of society and made a living by banditry and warfare. Such elements may have been the basis for the Norse stories of berserkers, fierce, possibly psychotic, warriors. In some sagas, berserkers appear in groups of vagabond outlaws. In the society of early medieval Iceland, where so much depended on the family, landholding, and well-defined rights of settlement, berserkers are seen as rootless outsiders. Several forms of the oath that legitimize the artificial clan survive in the sagas. One appears in Gisli's saga, where it is described in the following terms. Up by a long sod is cut from the turf, with both ends still attached to the ground. This is held a spear with a pattern-welded blade, the shaft of which is so long that a man with an outstretched arm can just reach the rivets that hold the head in position. Those who are making the bond mingle their blood into the earth, scratched up under the sod. Kneeling, they then swear an oath and shake hands, calling the gods to witness that they will avenge one another. Another artificial extension of the family group was the system of fostering. Young children or adolescents could be sent to live in a separate household. Such arrangements did not normally exceed the boundaries of the clan, the most common form of fostering being to an uncle. Early Germanic languages have several words describing the very particular relationships that were established by this system. In the household of their foster parent, the duties of a young male would be identical to those of a son by birth, including training for war. In the earliest phase of the Viking Age, all training would depend on these various forms of clan or pseudo-clan. Older members of the æt would pass on their knowledge of fighting techniques to the younger clan members, either in formal training sessions or possibly by passing on oral traditions. The latter might take the form of stories of past deeds or the lives of past heroes, stressing the obligations of a warrior. The particular brand of explosive violence that was the hallmark of poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson was encouraged at an early stage by Thord Granison. Thord is described in Egil's saga as young but older than Egil. Egil persuaded Thord to take him to the annual winter sports at White River Dale in Iceland. When Egil fell into an argument with Grim Hegson which led to blows, it was Thord who equipped and supported Egil for the slaying of Grim. At this time, Egil was less than 12 years old. A similar incident occurs in the early life of Grettir Asmundsson, although this does not end with a death, only threats of revenge. Grettir's first man-killing takes place when he is about 15 years old. If any reliance can be placed on these accounts, a picture of society emerges dominated by violence as an everyday means of settling minor disputes. Adolescent males are not excluded from this aspect of life, and extreme behavior was modified by relatively mild correction. By these means, the required attitude for a life of warfare was developed in the young. The semi-martial nature of the games that led Egil and Grettir to violence would give exercise and training in the handling of real weapons.